So today I'll be looking at, or diving into rather, Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. This is a book about how risk is and should be allocated throughout systems. Uh, it spends most of its time focusing on the improper allocation of risk through systems via various things like regulatory capture and perverse incentives, things like that. Right? So, if you don't know, Nassim Nicholas Taleb is an author of multiple other books, most famously likely the Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. Um, but before he was an author, he was an options trader and made a killing doing so, spotting black swans. These are things that others are blind to or think that are an impossibility, right? Uh, the name comes from, in the 1700s or whatever, before Australia was discovered, uh, English people, people in England, thought that there was only white swans existed. So they thought, impossibility is a black swan. And when explorers arrived in Australia and found black swans, that's where the name comes from. So this book, mainly about risk, right, and the way Nassim likes to refer to it is skin in the game. Skin in the game would be the proper allocation of risk in a system. It's also, it could be referred to as, someone saying the buck stops here. Truman had a famous sign on his desk that said that. And it's the idea of holding someone's feet to the fire, most particularly when there are externalities in the system. So there's downstream risks and costs that are spread out into society. This would be something like a power plant, producing CO2 as a byproduct of, processing coal or oil. And this would heat up the climate, obviously, and that is an externality. Or, sewage runoff from, whatever kind of plant into a river, harming, wildlife. This is most notably going to be applicable to two areas of life. You probably figured them out. It would be business and politics. These are also the places where there's also the most perverse allocation of risk in the systems. See, there's especially probably the most famous situation in this would be the 2007 and 8 financial collapse, where bankers and financial institutions offloaded risk onto the public because they were bailed out. Right? They weren't held to account. The individuals largely were not, criminalized, penalized either financially or legally. They weren't basically none in the grand scheme of things were sent to jail, although somewhere, it's very few. And the gains of their game that they were playing was, the gains were privatized. No one else gained except them, and many of them walked away, in effect, making hundreds of millions of dollars. And society paid for this. This is probably the most classical example in modern times of lack of skin in the game, lack of accountability, lack of responsibility, and however you want to refer to it. And then the obvious other one, politics. As recently, a massive storm hitting Texas devastated the water and power lines in the state. And Ted Cruz, while not directly responsible for the situation should, as an elected representative, be there helping out in whatever way that is, no matter how small or large the effect should be. He is representative of the state. He is a public servant and therefore should be accountable to the whatever. If the state does well, he does well. If the state does poorly, he should also, in effect, do poorly. But Ted Cruz tried to leave the state. He tried to flee to Cancun with his family. If he sent his family, that would be one thing. They're not elected officials or whatever, but he should have stayed behind, certainly, to help out his state. But there's countless other examples of politicians, even very recently, doing some very similar, kinds of things. Gavin Newsom, California, and Pelosi in California as well. Newsom went to the French Laundry inside restaurant with many other people, a couple dozen other people, all inside, all without masks, and of course, because they're elites, in an unbelievably expensive restaurant. And you have Pelosi going to get her hair cut at a salon, and then even attacked the salon after, evidence came out that she went to the salon, while at the same time, championing lockdowns and, shaming others who didn't follow the same practice, other states, other leaders, and just individuals doing that. And they're not held to the standards of the policies that they preach. If they had skin in the game, they would not be in an expensive restaurant. They would not be getting their hair cut. But perverse incentives, right? They get political cred for being hard on COVID, but they don't actually want to deal with the personal consequences of being hard on COVID. They don't have skin in the game. And they know they don't have skin in the game. This is why they allow themselves, they preach, some kind of virtue, but they never hold themselves to that account. And now we get to a less obvious area of lack of skin in the game, and it was one that surprised me twofold. One, how aggressive Nassim Taleb is. If you've never read any of his books, or if you don't follow him, personally on Twitter or any public speaking that he does, he's extremely Wall Street, shall we say, about his critiques. He's very harsh, very critical, doesn't really hold back the words he uses to be polite. He is extremely verbose, I guess. He uses very strong words in his critiques of individuals. And he was, in the book, he's extremely aggressive against certain scientists, more public-facing scientists. Sam Harris and Pinker are the ones that immediately come to mind that he critiqued. And the reason he critiques them is because, as he says, they are intellectual yet idiot. And the reason for this, why he says this, is because they lack, of course, skin in the game. Their ideas apply in ways that don't affect them, in his words, right? This is how he sees things. And I certainly see that to the extent in certain areas of science, more so than, more so certainly than what Sam Harris focuses on. You can see it most obviously in social sciences, where if you have to call something a science, it's not a science, right? So social sciences aren't real sciences. They don't follow the scientific method. They often say things that are unfalsifiable. Their experiments are non-repeatable, but that's kind of off topic, I guess, in a sense. to wind back to Sam Harris, you can see somewhat of what Nassim is referring to if you watch the debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. They're not really, debates. They're more of a dialectic. But they kind of got, if you watch it, they get, especially in the first one, they get stuck up on the idea of truth. And I think this is kind of indicative of what a lot of what Nassim's arguments focus around is applicable, usable information versus, more ethereal, not high utility or total lack of utility ideas. So Jordan Peterson's idea of truth is what you would call a metaphorical truth, right? His things he refers to as true are maybe not literally true, but they are metaphorically. And what does that mean? Metaphorical truths are things wherein the holder of the information is advantaged over people who do not hold this information. So if you believe in a metaphorical truth, and this I first heard this from Brett Weinstein, who actually was the person who mediated the second and third conversations between Jordan and Sam. He says that porcupines throwing their quills. Now, porcupines obviously cannot throw their quills. However, porcupines are quite a bit faster than they seem, than they look. And because of this, they can stick you with their quills. Believing that they can throw their quills will make the holder of this information be more hesitant about approaching them, keep a larger distance between themselves and the porcupine. Whereas somebody who knows the truth that they can't throw their quills might be less hesitant about getting close to the porcupine. Sam's inability to concede this, an understanding of this, as it seemed, kind of is like the entire, in my eyes, is the entire idea of Nassim's critique of scientism, right? Not actual science, but has the appearance of science. And these people are often very intelligent, but their incentives are not aligned in the way to produce utility. They gain not in relation to the quality of work inherently produced, but by many different incentives, attaining grants, which are usually due to references of works in other papers, which is not necessarily attributable to the quality of the work. It might be a lot of these people referencing your work are pointing out the failures of your paper, but often this doesn't actually matter in the terms of universities hiring you and your ability to get grants. All of this so far has been about negation, right? It's showing the importance of skin in the game by its negative, where it lacks. So what happens when there is a proper allocation of skin in the game, proper allocation of risk and incentives? Often it's rarely really highly rewarded. Those who assume risk in today's society are generally very favorably rewarded over time. You might take a risk and it doesn't pay off immediately, but your adoption of that risk not only makes you more responsible in a sense, wiser, it also signals to others that you are willing to take risk. And something that our evolution has yet to catch up with is that in today's society, if you take big risk and it doesn't pay off, you don't die. And this is really important because for the large part of human history, if you take big risk, you die. So we're the descendants of pessimists. We're the descendants of conservative, risk takers. But in modern society, that's not the case. If you take risk in modern society, you're generally either, rewarded to a near infinite degree, or you get a slight slap on the wrist. So if you take, investing, you can take, obviously you don't dump every, bit of your assets into one gamble. That'd be very stupid, obviously, because you can lose it all in that one gamble. But if you take consistent risk over time, that's maybe higher than the average investor or just average individual, because as an investor, you're adopting a higher level of risk generally than the general population who does not invest. You will, see sizably larger returns than those who do not take risks. And it doesn't have to be every time. And this is the whole idea behind, Nassim's investing strategy. He would bleed little bits over time, but every once in a while he would hit big, and those big gains are insanely disproportionate to what he lost in those times of bleeding. And a lot of incentives are actually against this. Human evolution is against this. We don't want to bleed over time. We want to take little gains over time, even though in the end it might lead to an implosion. This was 2007, 2008. They took these gains, and they were getting greedy, and they were wanting more and more gains for what they were doing. But at the end of it, they imploded. They took small gains over time and imploded. Where in the reverse, Nassim takes constant bleeding and makes a fortune. This is like the same thing with entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs bleed for years and years and years and years and years, and they might fail to launch multiple projects, companies over time, but once they hit that one, they earn more than a wage laborer will for their entire life. It's the disproportionate reward for risk taken, and that is the central tenet of risk taking in the modern era. Is that as long as you don't risk so much that you're blown out in an implosion at once, and you don't take a risk that could push you in jail, so you don't break the law. If you don't risk those two things, and you take smart, calculated, but relatively large on the grand scheme of things risks over time, you almost will invariably succeed. Yeah. Adoption of risk is also something as someone I've referenced before, in a sense, as Jordan Peterson. He talks about choosing to adopt as much responsibility as possible, and that's basically what adopting risk is, right? Like you becoming, you moving up, a company's hierarchy, you getting, more people that are working under you. That's an adoption of risk, right? You're gaining more leverage, you're gaining more, potential upside, but all the failures of those below you can, cause you to fail. So that's the risk that you're taking. If you're not that high up, you're not in charge of anyone else, then the downside is just what you've done. The potential risk is just what you've done. As a wage laborer, your risk is basically nothing, but your upside is also basically nothing in the grand scheme of things. So, Jordan Peterson is obviously talking more specifically about intrinsic reward. You're rewarded emotionally and potentially morally, and Nassim is talking obviously more on both the grand scale of society and allocation of risk and management of money, but it's at its core, it's the same idea. if you look at this cover here, hidden asymmetries in daily life, and you got a picture of a barbell. So, a couple of things here. First of all, and probably the less important one, this is Nassim Taleb's investing strategy, the barbell strategy. You take 90%, approximately of your investments, and you put it into things that just keep up with inflation. These would be things like, housing investments, right? Housing tends to scale with inflation, and you can get, ETFs, general broad market ETFs that, have many companies in many different fields, from technology to banking, finance, whatever. It's broad market, so it's low risk. And then you take 10% of your capital and you put it into high risk, high return assets. These would be things like options trading, most obviously very high risk, but high reward, angel investing, and venture capital, but those obviously need a large sum of capital to get into them. And then you can do things like IPOs, and SPACs would be the other high risk, high return, getting in a company at, what is the most base floor available to you. Obviously, a large investor, angel investor, gets in there far before you. Well, if it's an IPO or SPAC, but it's better than, the upside potential growth is obviously significantly higher than something, like whatever AT&T or even Apple, which is, even though it's a very large company, it does see a good amount of growth because leverage and technology and whatnot. More importantly, though, is, as I talked about before, the asymmetry and risk. So the asymmetry and risk between two parties, let's say, is most obviously shown in employer-employee or founder-employee relationships, where the founder, let's say, is has very high levels of risk. They could lose everything that they've worked for and put money into, in terms of years and assets that they put into making their company work. And you, as an employee, have the reverse of that. You have very low risk, but with that comes reward. So the employee has basically no risk at all. The higher end risk is that they simply lose their job, which isn't really anything in the grand scheme of things. And the potential gain is whatever they're earning at the time. That's it. Potentially they maybe get company equity if the company's a good company. They might get equity in the company, but that's the highest potential upside that they're going to get. But the founder has likely the large stake in the company, unless they have other outside investors, and they get all that profit. They see exponentially higher return, which is something that people just don't get on the whole. We're not wired, biologically speaking, to understand exponential risk. You can learn it, you can understand it very well, but most people don't think about it. They don't think about what that means and what that entails. And then somewhere in the middle ground, you have an investor, right? Somewhere in between the founder and the employee, where they might lose X amount of capital, 2-5%, whatever, of their total portfolio in this company if it goes to zero, and the potential upside is whatever percent of the equity that they got for their investment. But as you see, the higher risk here is the higher return. Criticisms of this book. I have two. My criticisms are two. First, and less importantly, is the book is likely longer. Almost certainly longer than need be. Part of this is because I'm not trying to be a dick here, but Taleb seems to like hearing himself talk, which I can't. It would be very critical, very hypocritical of me to be overly critical of this, because I am largely the same way, and I ramble far more than need be. But more importantly, the much more important criticism of the book is that this idea of Lindy, and this is something I'm not completely critical of, but I am more critical of it than I am any other idea in this book. And what Lindy is the idea of Lindy comes from this, heuristic from a that was a heuristic that was like made basically in a restaurant. Lindy's Cafe, I believe it was, something like that. It is a restaurant that a lot of Broadway actors and actresses frequented, and they would talk about the success and failures of other, plays, their own, other people's, and whatnot. And they had this heuristic where if a play, let's say, lasted for 3 weeks, it was likely to last 3 weeks more. If it lasted for 6 weeks, it would last for 6 weeks more. It kind of plays into his idea of anti-fragility, making a system that lasts and can endure. My problem with this idea as initially put, and he expands on it through the book, but the essential tenet of it and the naming of it, it's inductivism, right? It's a rule of thumb, and it's only as good as it is until it isn't good anymore. Right? It's moderately predictive, but it's not perfectly predictive. Right? You can't figure out if something's going to be good based on its precepts, or last based on its precepts. The inputs into the theorem, let's say, are not directly linked to the outputs. There isn't some, there's a black box here that that is impossible to know, in a sense. I don't know. It was just the one bit of the book that I just didn't really get, I guess. I didn't really understand why it was necessary. It felt different and unconnected from the rest of the book, in a sense. Anyway, overall, it's a very good book, and it's something that I feel like anyone in a position of power within a hierarchy, or business, or which is a hierarchy, obviously, or government, another hierarchy. Anyone in an upper level in a hierarchy needs to read, because the lack of foresight in allocating risk and managing risk can easily lead to the implosion of said hierarchy, and it does a really good job of making it easy to understand. Honestly, very easy to understand it. So yeah, that's my bit on the book. Definitely worth the read.